Good evening, everyone. We're here on our second day of BrELT Week. Today, earlier, we had Priscilla Bordon talking to us. And now we have our diva, Natalia Guerreiro, to tell us a little bit about her context of work. And to help me moderate this webinar, we have Andrea Câmara, my dear friend. Angie, thank you very much. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Natalia. She's been a teacher since 2000, and she has been working in aviation English assessment and teaching for the Brazilian Air Force for 8.5 years. She holds a CELTA, a BA in English and Portuguese from UFRJ, and an MA in Applied Linguistics from the University of Melbourne. She's been elected to the BRAZ-TESOL Advisory Council for the 2017-2018 term and is responsible for the blog Aviation English Hub.wordpress.com. Without further ado, our dear diva, Natalia Guerreiro.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrea and Barbara and BrELT for the opportunity and the warm welcome. And I'm going to start screen sharing so you won't have to see what books I got on my shelf. And there we down the rabbit hole we go. Okay. So, yes, like Barbara said, I'll be talking about my context of work, which and focusing on aviation English. Is it an ELF context? Our skies without borders. And why am I talking about this? Well, about 9 years ago, I joined the Air Force as a civilian English teacher. I work for an institute in São José dos Campos, which is not ITA and not Embraer either. It's ISEA, the Airspace Control Institute. And in the team that is responsible for APLIS, which is a test of English for air traffic controllers, and also the training, proficiency training of air traffic controllers in Brazil. And what are air traffic controllers? Just to begin with, this month, one of the trendiest hashtags was bad stock photos of my job. And out of curiosity, I decided to Google stock photos of air traffic controllers. And that's what I got, which is a very common mistake. That guy is not an air traffic controller. He is a marshaller. So that's not what air traffic controllers do. And apparently, pilots also, even though they're more well-known, they're better known, according to stock photos, they like making very ample gestures and flying their own arms instead of actual machines. So as you can see, stock photos are not something to go by. Air traffic controllers actually work inside confined spaces, such as towers. There you can see our largest tower, which is Guarulhos. In terms of air movements, it's the largest one in Brazil. And most people can imagine controllers there because we can see the tower when we go to airports, and we can imagine that there will be civilians working there. And that's true. However, most air traffic controllers in Brazil are actually in the military. They work for the Air Force. They are often sergeants or chief master sergeants. And for the most part, when you're flying, you're actually not under the responsibility of a tower controller. You're actually under the responsibility of an area control center or an approach control. And for those controllers, your plane is a plot on a radar screen. They cannot actually see your plane with, like, out the window. And not only what they do is hard to imagine, but the actual communication is quite different. If you're filing your nails or looking someplace else, please refer to the screen again. We have here a comic strip, and the duck, which is a plane, a pilot, is going Mayday, 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 and the controller, probably a trainee, says, "No, you're wrong. Mayday is months away." And the pilot is about to crash and says, "Mayday is the international distress call." And the controller says, "Why didn't you say so the first time?" And this is pretty much how I felt when I started dealing with aviation English. It's that everything is so different. They have a different way of saying things I used to say, and say they also say things I never even thought conceived of saying. It was indeed a whole new world, a new fantastic point of view. And that's what I mean to bring to you today, an introduction to aviation English, because I see in our community many people wanting to teach pilots, especially pilots, but also air traffic controllers, and they don't know where to look for information, how to help them. So this is a bird's eye view, that's funny, a plane's eye view of aviation English within a perspective of English as a lingua franca. So first and foremost, I need to say that aviation English is actually a misnomer. There are many aviation Englishes. In fact, as many aviation Englishes as there are professionals in aviation. And aviation is sort of like the cinema. You know, when you go see a movie and you think that you only think of the actors and maybe the director. And at the end, when the credits go up, there's like a long list of people, and the third coffee bringer sort of thing. And if you need that many people to make a movie, let alone to bring you from A to B in safety and miles away up in the air. So there are meteorologists, of course, cabin crew, people know, the flight attendants, mechanics. Mechanics speak need a different kind of English. For example, they read manuals, they read failure reports, they write responses to failure reports. There are AIS operators, which you've probably never even heard of, but they're very important at the beginning and planning of a flight. Flight dispatchers, ground crew, and so on and so forth. But oftentimes, when we're talking about aviation English, what we actually mean is the English spoken by pilots and controllers to each other. Oh, and that communication is done over the radio, which is why many people also refer to that kind of English as radio telephony English. And you can see my point here that aviation English is connected, is usually used to describe pilots and controllers by the very books that you can use to teach pilots and controllers. For example, Aviation English by Macmillan. For ICAO compliance, ICAO only has, as of now, requirements for pilots and controllers. English for Aviation for pilots and air traffic controllers. Flight Path, Aviation English for pilots and controllers. There are books, for example, for cabin crew, English for cabin crew, but then they say English for cabin crew, they don't use the expression Aviation English. But what are the characteristics of that aviation English used by controllers, air traffic control, ATC, and pilots? Well, I'm going to show you a video, and I would like you to, in the chat box, type the impressions that you get in terms of language. What characterizes this language that you can hear? Please, Andrea, I'll stop sharing now.
Okay. I'll share your window, okay? Can you see my window, everyone? Can you see my screen?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
But I cannot hear your sound.
Cannot? Okay, just a second. I think it's still, I can still see your screen. So let me try again.
Yeah, no, to me, I can see both of you, but nobody's screen.
Yeah, okay. Because I can only share the entire screen. Okay, let me try. Okay. Let me tell me if you can hear it. Yeah?
No.
Can you hear it?
No.
Okay, just a second.
I assure you, we tested.
Okay, now? Can you hear it?
We can hear it.
Control is essential to flight safety. Maybe you wonder how we do. In this video, we're going to teach you the basics. Goedemorgen Amsterdam, KLM 574, passing flight level 320, descending flight level 260. If we want to talk to the air traffic controller, most of the time we use the VHF radio and talk to ATC by the push-to-talk switch, either on the communication panel or on the side stick.
Good morning, Speedbird 138, flight level 360. Speedbird 138, good morning, contact. KLM 574, contact BRA 133, decimal 530, goodbye. 133.5.
KLM 574, descent flight level 100.
Descent flight level 100, KLM 574. KLM 574 heavy.
KLM 574, inland Sierra Papa Yankee, level 50 over the 185.
Thank you more, flight level 50 over 185,
KLM 574, turn left heading 270, reduce to speed to 20 knots.
Heading 270, speed 220, KLM 574.
KLM 574, turn left heading 215 to accept ILS gate approach runway 18 right.
Left heading 215, clear approach 25, KLM 574. 215 checked. Twice short, what check. Step is 1 right, KLM 574.
KLM 574, Roger, 4.5 miles, wind Fokker, contact tower 118, decimal 275.
18275, KLM 574. KLM 574, 1
574, number 3.
Number 3, KLM 574. Captain, take your seats. Here, get
574, 1 right, clear the line for with 107.
1 right, clear the line, KLM 574.
574, taxi Echo 9, and cross over 1 center of Whiskey 5.
Taxi Echo 9 across 1 center Whiskey 5, KLM 574.
KLM 574, contact 1 goedemorgen.
Wachtwoord tot ziens, KLM 574. Wachtwoord, KLM 574, 1 center,
KLM 574, Alpha North Echo 9.
Alpha North Echo 9, KLM 574.
Okay. So if you'd like.
So let me switch back.
Yeah.
All right.
So if you'd like to see that movie, the video again, it's KLM Cockpit something Part 5. Cockpit Stories, I think. I cannot see the YouTube chat now, but what characteristics did you notice in terms of language? Andrea, can you say what they're saying?
Just a second. Let me go back.
Barbara?
I'm still waiting. Yeah. The YouTube.
I'm on it, but there aren't any comments yet.
Yes.
Come on, don't be shy. We have 3 experts in there.
Was it too loud?
No, it was okay. It was okay. Thank you. Yeah. So something that people usually notice straight ahead is that it's more difficult to understand. So is that the impression you two had?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah,
Sonia Mello here said lots of codes, letters to spell, numbers.
yes, indeed. Lots of numbers, lots of
Yeah.
the letters, and they are also pronounced differently. For example, instead of A, B, C, they go Alpha, Bravo, Charlie to avoid confusion. Because if you ever had to spell your name over the phone, you probably quickly realize how similar B, C, D, and basically all the letters are. Over the phone, and that's basically the situation. So that's why they say Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, etc. Numbers are also sometimes pronounced differently. Four, for example, is said four or four to differentiate from the preposition. Anything else that people have said?
Yeah, they're saying here they do not carry long conversations. Right, people heard like a standardized chunks. Right, somebody said that it sounded like a little bit of like the conversation was in the old telegraph. You know, the idea she had that everything was like coded.
Yes, perfect.
That's codes, right?
A brilliant comment. Yes, the language is indeed concise. They have documents that oversee, like tell them how this communication has to be, and one of them says it has to be concise, precise, and unambiguous. And when we're linguists, we don't believe that language can ever be unambiguous, but when we're traveling, we pretty much appreciate the effort not to have miscommunications. So it is a very transactional sort of interaction, as they noticed. So there isn't much like trying to strengthen bonds of friendship or anything. It's mainly information that is being passed back and forth. And like she said, or somebody said, there is standard phraseology. So there is a code in these documents. The language is listed in these documents, and they have to say it exactly as it is there. And that often means omitting functional words, omitting some prepositions, some pronouns. For example, they don't say you are cleared for takeoff. They say cleared for takeoff, omitting the pronoun you and the auxiliary verb. Copular verb be also is sometimes omitted, like landing gear down and locked, instead of the landing gear is down and locked. But there is such a thing also called plain English, and we're going to see what it is soon enough. As for standard phraseology, these are two documents that list the phraseology in case you're interested. One is the Manual of Radio Telephony, which was written and issued by ICAO. ICAO is the International Civil Aviation Organization. It is a branch of the United Nations, and it oversees civil aviation, much like UNESCO oversees world education. ICAO oversees world aviation. But of course, UNESCO cannot go to your university or school and tell you, oh, you should do this, that, and the other. Same goes for ICAO. ICAO cannot determine what countries do in terms of aviation. So that's sort of a list of recommendations in terms of phraseology of the language that is codified. And it's not a law. And the countries then make their own phraseology manuals. That's ours. MCA 116, which is freely available for download. But you'll be pleased to hear that Brazil pretty much follows the international recommendations in terms of phraseology. The difference is our document is bilingual because air traffic control in Brazil is done mostly in Portuguese. Because Brazilian controllers talking to Brazilian pilots speak Portuguese, and that's 70% of our flights. Only about 30% of our flights are international, and that's the case when we speak English, okay, by regulation. A Brazilian pilot can choose to talk in English to a Brazilian controller, but by regulation, if the aircraft is foreign, it doesn't matter if the pilot was born and raised here, we have to speak English. It doesn't matter if the aircraft is from Portugal or Angola, and there's Portuguese speakers as well. It's a foreign aircraft, we speak English. But that's only 30% of the time. So what does phraseology look like? In case you're interested, you can download those documents. It's a list of words. So like acknowledge means let me know that you've received this message. Affirm, and so sometimes pronounced as affirm instead of yes. So they don't say yes, they say affirm. They don't say no, they say negative, and so on and so forth. There are even whole dialogues that have to be set in the exact same way. And they often start, they have to start with indicating who is speaking and who I'm speaking to. So there is no ambiguity. So I don't have the wrong aircraft repeating, understanding, taking that information or instruction. So that's all very well. And it happens if you're teaching pilots or air traffic controllers, it will help you to understand what phraseology is like. Just bear in mind that you cannot teach it. It's considered operational knowledge. Only a pilot or an air traffic controller can teach phraseology. You, as an English teacher, can learn about phraseology to know what it's like, but you can ever cross your heart and hope to die teach it. So what can we teach? We can teach plain English. And plain English is what you can see here mixed with phraseology. This is an interaction that actually happened. JFK Tower, so New York controller, and a TAM pilot, so a Brazilian pilot. The Brazilian pilot was having problem with the landing gear or undercarriage, however you want to call it, which is basically the wheels of the plane. So JFK says, TAM 8078 heavy, Kennedy Tower, I'm being told that your nose gear appears to be in the wrong position. And Tom replies, negative, the nose gear, the landing, is down and locked. But we don't have the nose steering, so we need to maintain the runway after landing. So to us, maybe it all sounds codified, but what is codified is what I have highlighted here for you. It's TAM 8078 heavy, calling the aircraft. Kennedy Tower, identifying the tower. Gear appears is phraseology. Negative is phraseology. Landing gear down and locked is phraseology, although the pilot used the verb to be there. She said landing gear. She, by the way, it was a female pilot. Landing gear is down and locked. She said is, which is in phraseology, is omitted. But all the rest, I'm being told that your nose appears to be in the wrong position. We don't have the nose wheel steering, so we need to maintain the runway after landing. None of this is codified because the documents do not foresee every possible situation that could happen. And even if they did, no human being would be able to ever memorize it. So that's why when the phraseology is not enough, they use English to fill in the spots if they're speaking English. Otherwise, they use their proficiency in Portuguese to fill in the gaps of phraseology. And that's the English that we focus on. Of course, this plain English is supposed to be also concise, precise, and unambiguous, and very phraseology-like. So much so that Kim, a researcher from Korea, South Korea, said plain English, which by the way is spelled P-L-A-I-N, it's not aircraft English, it's plain, as in simple, is really not simple at all. She says plain English is not plain at all. Because as you can see, it's very different from what we considered a basic, simple English. It is, of course, English for speaking, over the radio and listening over the radio. It doesn't involve, as of now, reading and writing. That can change in the future with technology to come, but not for now. It's not the English that is described in the Common European Framework. It's not English that you use to go shopping. It is the English used by pilots and controllers to communicate over the radio about things pilots and controllers talk about. And ICAO, which, as I said, is a branch of the UN, in 2001, if I'm not mistaken, added that requirement that pilots and controllers needed a minimum level of English. They needed to be trained in English, and they needed to be assessed in terms of their English language proficiency. But again, not their proficiency to go shopping, their proficiency to talk over the radio about pilot and controller things. And in 2004 and later in 2010, ICAO issued 2 editions of DOC 9835. If you work with pilots or controllers teaching or testing their English, you need to know this by heart. So basically, very important, download manual on the implementation of ICAO language proficiency requirements. That's key to start teaching pilots or controllers. And pilots will often come to you and say, oh, I'd like to pass the ICAO test. And pilots will say what they want to say, but you will know that there is no such a thing as the ICAO test. ICAO hasn't developed any tests. Pilots in Brazil usually sit the Santos Dumont English Assessment, which is developed and delivered by ANAC, so our civil aviation agency. And you can go to their website and see a mock test there and some instructions to help you prepare the pilot, if you so wish to. And if you're preparing a controller, then they're probably talking about not the ICAO test, but the EPLEAS test, which is the test my team is responsible for. It's applied to all 4,000 air traffic controllers in Brazil for about that. And we all follow the recommendations of DOC 9835, including the rating scale. The rating scale has 6 levels, from 1 to 6. The highest level is 6, and the minimum level to be considered operational is 4. And controllers and pilots are assessed under pronunciation, structure, vocabulary, fluency, comprehension, and interactions. And you can see, or maybe you can't because the font is probably too small for you, but level 4 is a level that includes errors. For example, in structures, basic grammatical structures and sentence patterns are used creatively and are usually well controlled. Errors may occur, but rarely interfere with meaning. So there's that idea. You can make mistakes in structure, in vocabulary, in fluency, you can hesitate, but you never prevent effective communication because, after all, you need to get that message across. All information in air traffic control tends to be essential. Same goes for comprehension. You can use clarification strategies, but you need to understand what people are saying if people are intelligible to the aeronautical community. And you have to be able to deal with a misunderstanding or a potential misunderstanding by checking, confirming, and clarifying. So you see that this idea of being able to use your strategic competence strategies to overcome the challenge of that communication is very well in the rating scale at level 4. So you can kind of see an English as a lingua franca perspective there. And you see that perspective as well in other parts of the document. For example, in the 2004 edition, the first edition, we didn't have this part, but then in 2010, they added a whole section about the case of English as a lingua franca. And they mentioned the lingua franca core by Jenkins. They mentioned accommodation. They mentioned the problems of accent bias. So all very well within English as a lingua franca. On the other hand, the rating scale, which has been the same since 2001, I think, says level 4, yes, clarification, ask for clarification, negotiate meaning, all the best. Extended level 5, it says, while skills in checking, seeking confirmation, and clarification remain important, they are less frequently deployed. So according to ICAO, a level 4 uses many strategies. Level 5 doesn't need to. Why? Because maybe they're thinking the more proficient you are, the fewer strategies you need, because you don't have to compensate for lack of proficiency. But maybe you do need to accommodate to a weaker speaker, or to somebody who is just as strong, just as a good speaker as you are, but they come from a different culture, or they have different expectations, and you have to deal with that. And it's funny that the highest level doesn't even mention strategies at all. Sentence there is, it interacts with these in nearly all situations. Expert speakers display no difficulties in reacting or initiating interaction, no difficulties, and no mention of strategies. So where did accommodation go? Where did that talk of English as a lingua franca go when we see the rating scale? Good news is, one of the tests that has been developed based on the rating scale is EUPAC. I don't know how they pronounce it there. I say EUPAC because I'm Brazilian. But anyway, it's an English language proficiency for aeronautical communication. Probably they say EUPAC, I'm thinking of it. And their test of English for level 4, for example, has been so far the only one that is still accredited by ICAO. So they're very good, the most important probably test center in terms of aviation English. And they have also developed a level 6 test, which so far hasn't been accredited. But you see that their level 6 test takes accommodation into consideration. They test how to understand and avoid idiomatic English. So being a competent English as a lingua franca speaker, so much so that you try not to use slang or idioms or that will complicate, that will make it difficult for other people to understand you. Recognize and avoid ambiguity. Use clear and concise English, negotiate meaning, clarify potential misunderstanding. So there you go. They did think of those aspects. The document keeps doing that. Like you have something like, they think of cross-cultural communication. So they go from what Jenkins yesterday talked about, the first phase of ELF, talking about the core, and they even bring the idea of multilingualism and cross-cultural communication. And they go so far as to say that native speakers of English have an ethical obligation to increase their linguistic awareness and to take special care in the delivery of messages. So they're also attributing responsibility to native English speakers for the success of the communication between pilots and air traffic controllers. And they say participants in general, natives, non-natives, whatever, they are better served by acquiring an awareness of the challenges of cross-cultural communication, an openness to accommodating different accents and dialects, so they need to understand different accents, techniques for recognizing and negotiating communication breakdowns. So very much an English as a lingua franca perspective there. They have to be exposed to different accents. They have to be aware of the difficulties of cross-cultural communication. And if you read literature on aviation English, what researchers have been saying, it corroborates what ICAO had down on the document there, the importance of having that awareness. They go so far as to say that a native English speaker may demonstrate level 2 in terms of pronunciation. Level 2, remember, is the second lowest, which means not operational, if they are not readily understood by those outside of that particular region. So if you live in a native speaker country, but only people from your region understand you, then you wouldn't pass the test, not even in level in terms of pronunciation. Excuse me. However, the thing is, native English speakers are not tested. Monolingual native English speakers, says the same document, should be considered probable expert speakers. They can be evaluated through informal assessments. In the US, at first, they had medical doctors, physicians, doing their the controllers and pilots. They need to be constantly checked by doctors, and doctors would give them a clean bill of health plus, okay, you speak English, all right, because I asked you a few questions and you replied. So, and that would be added as an informal assessment to their portfolio, which would include their place of birth and early residence. So basically where they were born and raised, as evidence that they speak good aviation English. So where did the native speaker responsibility for the success go if only non-native speaker English, non-native speakers are being tested? And as the cartoon shows, we have here a tower in the US, and the controller is asking the many pilots, does anybody up there speak Midwestern? So not only he needs or she needs the pilots to speak English, but actually their dialect of English. Here's some evidence from Biswanger, a German researcher. He did what you should never do, which is read forums online. Biswanger, if you're watching this, forums and comments on the internet is where our hopes and dreams go to die. And what he saw was that there was this incident with a pilot from Ecuador and a controller from the US. And the pilot and the controller were talking faster than the recommendation by ICAO, over 200 words per minute. And the pilot was reading back quickly, so the pilot was repeating the key information quickly. But the pilot was proceeded to the wrong runway, which was a problem because there was another aircraft on that runway. So the controller sort of freaks out and starts using plain English and a faster pace. The controller starts speaking over 250 words per minute and using language that was not standard phraseology when standard phraseology was available and he could have used it. What happened was the non-native speaker pilot starts taking longer to reply and speaks more slowly, of course. And when Biswanger read the comments, people were saying, these people need to speak English. These people, by the way, is us, non-native speakers of the language. They need to speak English. As if, by the way, air traffic controllers and pilots were speaking the same kind of English that we learn in school or they learned when they grew up. They said, mama, water, and then they said clear for takeoff, probably, because that's their native language. And when somebody suggested that people look at the role of the controller speaking too fast, using wordy instructions, unnecessary explanations, and that could have caused the incident. It wasn't an accident. Nobody got hurt, fortunately. But they said, no, how dare you? The ATCO, the controller, the native speaker, is a hero because he prevented the accident. The researchers, such as Biswanger, Kim, and so on and so forth, they keep reminding us of the co-constructed nature of communication. It's not only one person communicating there. It takes two to tango. And it would do well for aviation English if we had a more English as a lingua franca informed view of communications, not only paying lip service to it, but actually implementing it. Because it takes two to Papa Tango. Okay, that's a joke that only the controllers and aviation English teachers who are already teaching got. But Papa Tango is a common prefix for aircraft. So is English, aviation English, a case of English as a lingua franca? Well, if you think of Seidlofer's definition, any use of English among speakers of different first languages for whom English is the communicative medium of choice and often the only option. Let's see if this applies to aviation English. Is it a use of English? Yes, arguably, or maybe not, because it's so different, right, from general English that is almost a different language. In fact, Tripp, who's done her PhD into the phonology of aviation English, she said that English is farther away from aviation. Aviation English is farther away from general English than English is from French. So almost like a different language in terms of intonation, which was what she was studying. So it's a use of English, arguably, by speakers of different first languages, and sometimes in the case of aviation, even speakers of the first language. For example, in Europe, they all speak English. And sometimes it's a Belgian pilot talking to a Belgian controller. For whom, well, I think it's most of Europe that is like that, not all of it. For whom English is the communicative medium of choice, yes, but there isn't much choice in the matter. It's all regulation, but yeah, that's what they choose. And so maybe you could say it is English as a lingua franca. However, is it English? Is it really a lingua franca? Or because if you actually adopt a lingua franca view, then you cannot use a native speaker as a yardstick, especially the idealized native speakers that we often do. English language speakers cannot have the cake and eat it too. So we cannot have English as the language that we are all using, and then not expect the fact that we have many users from a different background. We cannot expect it not to change the language a bit and the ownership of the language. So skies without borders, yeah, it's basically seamless. We don't see when we're being transferred from a country to another country, but I wouldn't say it's skies without bias. So we are in the process, I would argue, to get a true English as a lingua franca perspective in aviation English. So to round up, I love this quote by Dan Douglas, an American researcher. In the end, I believe we have a professional ethical responsibility to continue to study the phenomenon of aviation radio telephony and the role of both native and non-native speakers of English in maintaining communication. And he suggests a new focus on interactional competence within a framework of English as a lingua franca. And he says, his words on mine, which ICAO espouses. So ICAO espouses the view of English as a lingua franca, according to him, but has not put into practice, according to him. And I agree. So if we use a more interactional competence in the framework of English as a lingua franca, that will go a long way toward achieving the desired goals of, and these are very lofty and noble goals, safety and efficient, effective communication in international air travel. So it's a tall order to us, and here's a call to arms by Douglas. If you want to join the fight, and you are interested in learning more about aviation English, I keep a website with a list of references. We got textbooks, books, articles, everything there. aviationenglishhub.wordpress.com. You can also listen to air traffic controllers and pilots in real life, live8c.net, especially their link called Interesting Recordings. So you have something different happening there. And also join ICAO. ICAO is the International Civil Aviation English Association, and it's free to join. So there is no reason not to. And they also have, in addition to their own website, there is an ICAO forum in which many of these aspects are discussed. And this forum is hosted by LinkedIn. Here are some of the references I used. Thank you very much. And if there are any questions, speak now or forever hold your peace.
Thank you, Natalie, very much. That was a whole lot of information. I'm really baffled with how many details and subtleties Aviation English entails, really. Thank you very much.
It is very different, a whole new world, as I said.
Yes, you. Andy, would you like to carry out questions from YouTube?
Yes, I'm looking right now. We don't have questions as of yet. So people are clapping. There are hearts. Clap, clap, clap.
When I mentioned non-natives who are unintelligible, somebody who is married to a Scottish guy said, Glasgow.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Let's not name names, but some cities are hard to understand.
There is an interesting comment I found here by Sonia, and she said that I imagine word and sentence stress plays a very important role there too. Would you like to comment on that, Nancy?
Okay, word and sentence stress. Well, Jenkins says that word stress is a gray area. So, yeah, we don't know. But even ICAO says that it's difficult to list everything that makes things intelligible and not intelligible across context. So we never know whether word stress is that important. I have evidence, however, that sentence stress, like Jenkins said, nuclear stress is important for intelligibility, even in air traffic control. So, for example, I didn't want you to overload. I didn't want to overload you with that information. That was me holding back, by the way. I didn't want to overload you with information. But there is something called the read back, hear back cycle. So when a controller issues an instruction that is a key, the pilot has to repeat it back to the controller so the controller knows that the pilot understood it. That's, by the way, very useful in life too. When you're telling your spouse, please buy milk and cheese, read back in full. And then your spouse says, cheese and milk, good. So you can good to go to the supermarket. So that's what they do. And if your spouse repeats cheese and water, what are you going to do? You're going to use contrastive stress. You're going to say negative, cheese, and milk. Then you're going to emphasize you're making longer, you're making higher, you're making it stronger. That's contrastive stress, and that's very important as a strategy in air traffic control.
Yeah,
I'll certainly try that.
People are going to try to talk like that at home.
Yes. I think your webinar was the most commented so far. There are many people here saying they love you, and that's very interesting.
Yes. Yeah, that doesn't fly, does it?
Ana Carolina says, I'll try that at home.
Yeah. Then she said, Sonia is saying that it can be hard to transcribe controllers and pilots in those black boxes. Well, the people who transcribe accidents and incidents are people who are used to that language. So that's not a problem. However, in media, media will have you think that it's impossible to understand it. So, for example, once a certain Brazilian network aired a communication between pilots and controllers, and the British pilot they transcribed the Brazilian controller, they started putting like question marks and saying unintelligible. Now, it wasn't intelligible maybe for to the journalist, but air traffic controllers, I think the world over, would know what the controller was saying. So when you're used to that, when you're exposed to it, you actually understand it. So, and of course, the news program had cut it after "I do not understand, sir," claiming that the pilot did not understand the controller's English. But in fact, the pilot didn't understand the procedure, not the English. So we have to be careful.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. Thank you very much for that. Anna is saying that she's amazed at how you make all this information accessible to us.
Well, 9 years in training, because I couldn't understand a single thing when I started. And what they did at the Air Force, which was amazing, is they got us English teachers with good proficiency in English and a lot of good intentions, and put us together with their traffic controllers so they wouldn't let us do anything wrong. So that's who I learned from the air traffic controllers. And so for 9 years, they have been my source of knowledge, and also to our team. And there is one watching it, by the way, right, Thiago?
He's made a couple of comments throughout your talk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're fantastic. Yeah.
I would like to ask you, you just mentioned a little bit about that, but did you take any kind of training, formal training to get into this area? How did it happen?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, with us, we had that privilege because we work for the Air Force. So we work in direct contact with our traffic controllers. If you're teaching ESP and you're teaching pilots, then your expert is your student. And that's something that happens with pretty much any ESP. The power balance kind of shifts there because they know more about their field than you do. Theoretically, you know more about English, but in the case of aviation English, which is very different, you need to study a lot and be prepared. So you can use the textbooks as a guide, but you need to read Doc 9835. You need to be familiar not only with the test, but also with the real life situation where they use the language. Because this is something key. You're not going to be preparing them just for the test. There are teachers out there that just tell students all the questions that are in the test. Now, can you think if the pilot is almost there, almost at the level where they could be a little up, that kind of strategy can push them up. Do you really want that? Do you really want pilots who do not have the level to pass the test? So it's something for us to think about. It's a lot of responsibility. It is possible to be prepared for it. And there are even courses that you can take. Aline Pacheco has delivered a workshop in Rio Grande do Sul. There have been courses in São Paulo by international teachers that fly in. But in Brazil, that's basically what you got. Otherwise, you need to go abroad and take these short aviation English teaching courses.
Right. Paula commented here saying that it's a negative washback effect. Yes,
the negative washback effect. That's by the way, her what she's studying for her PhD. So if you want to learn more about washback, read her thesis, which is in the works as we speak.
Okay, Nati, again, thank you very, very much for being here with us. I would like to give a huge thanks to Andrea Camara too.
Thank you.
So kind as to follow us together with Priscilla and now with Nati.
My pleasure.
It's been a great day.
It's been a great week. Thank you all at BrELT for organizing it.
Thank Priscilla. It was all her idea, her hard work, her people, her field of study as well. They're all amazing.
She's fantastic.
Yes, she is. I'd like to remind you all that September 7th, we are in São Paulo for BrELT on the Road 2nd edition. So that's a heads up and an invitation from Rio to everyone. São Paulo, September 7th, Cultura Inglesa e Higienópolis, our face-to-face meeting.
And the call for papers is still open, right?
Yes, call for papers goes until the end of ELF week, June 11th.
And the early bird prize.
Early bird fee.
Yeah, I'm gonna sign up. Yes.
It's an amazing week. We have ELF week going on. We have call for papers still being accepted, and we also have the early bird fee. So thank you very much, ladies. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Natalia. It was great.
Tomorrow.
Okay.
Bye.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.